Good morning, everyone. This is our topic for the day. It's the cardiorespiratory responses to acute exercise. Now, after reviewing the basic anatomy and physiology of the cardiovascular and respiratory systems, this time we'll look specifically at how these systems respond to the increased demands placed on our body or on the body during acute exercise. So let's recall now let's recall what acute exercise is. So acute exercise is defined as a single bout of exercise. This means that whatever responses, physiological responses that our cardiovascular and respiratory systems would do is that it is temporary and it's short term so that it can respond to the demands of exercise. These changes in the cardiorespiratory system will return to normal values once exercise ends. So again, it is temporary physiological response so that we can, or the body can react to the demands of exercise. Now, with exercise, oxygen demands or the oxygen demand by active muscles increases significantly. More nutrients are used as well. Metabolic processes speed up, so more waste products are created. During prolonged exercise or exercise in a hot environment, our body temperature also increases. Now, these are just examples on what happens to our body when we exercise. So in this chapter, we'll break down the responses of our cardiorespiratory systems to acute exercise. So in this chapter, we will describe the cardiovascular responses to acute exercise, and we also examine the respiratory responses to acute exercise. So let's dive into the cardiovascular responses to acute exercise. So there are numerous interrelated cardiovascular changes that occur during dynamic exercise or acute exercise. Now, the primary goal of adjustments of our cardiovascular system is to increase blood flow to working muscles. Now, to better understand the changes that occur, we'll examine the following and see how these changes are integrated to maintain adequate blood pressure and provide blood to the exercising body's needs. So we'll examine the following responses. So heart rate, we'll look at that. Stroke volume, blood flow, and of course, our blood. So first response of our cardiovascular system is the heart rate. So what happens to our heart rate when we exercise? We mentioned previously that our heart rate is an indicator of how many times our heart contracts to pump blood out of its chambers and throughout the body. Along with this line, heart rate is also a good indicator of relative exercise intensity or how hard our body exerts effort. Now, to know the difference in heart rate, so we'll have a look on the normal values of our heart rate when we are at rest. So, resting heart rate or RHR on average is around 60 to 80 beats per minute. Okay? If you're an average person, again, male or female, the range is 60 to 80 beats per minute. However, if you are aerobically trained, if you are an endurance athlete, this resting heart rate values can decrease and have a range between 28 to 40 beats per minute. But do take note that our resting heart rate, or actually our heart rate, is affected by extreme temperature and altitude. Right? So that's your resting heart rate. Now, what happens to our heart rate just before we exercise? So actually, there's a anticipatory response. Our body anticipates work ahead. So if we anticipate that exercise is coming, no, exercise will occur, the pre-exercise heart rate, or our heart rate, will increase above resting values. So pre-exercise heart rate is normally above resting values due to the body's anticipatory response, because we anticipate that exercise will occur, our heart rate goes higher than our normal resting values. So this means, no, in application, when someone asks you to get your resting heart rate, you shouldn't get it just before you exercise, because your heart rate is normally elevated in anticipation for exercise. So when is the best time to get your resting heart rate? Just before you wake up. No, not just before. Just after you wake up, no, when you open your eyes, that's when you get your resting heart rate. That's the best time to get your resting heart rate. Right? So we know our resting values now. We know that it increases, the heart rate increases in anticipation for exercise. So what happens to our heart rate when we and during exercise? So normally, no, our heart rate increases directly in proportion to the increase in exercise intensity. So as our exercise intensity increases, our heart rate also increases. So if, let's say, your intensity level is like 60%, your heart rate also increases. So it's gonna be more than your resting heart rate, right? In extreme temperatures, we said kanina, no, that our heart rate actually is affected by extreme temperatures and altitude. So when you exercise in extreme temperatures, there will be an increase of beats per minute. Now, for every degree centigrade that is increased. So let's say you're exercising at 60% intensity at a 38 degrees temperature. Normally, your BPM, or beats per minute, is 150. But if you exercise higher than 38, so 1 degree centigrade, 39 degrees, no, at intensity levels of 60%, instead of 150, there's an increase in approximately 10 beats per minute. So your heart rate could reach up to 160 beats per minute. So in terms of altitude naman, no, if you're exercising at an altitude that is higher, or at 14,000 feet above sea level, there will be a 10 to 30% increase in heart rate. So at intensities of 60% and you're exercising at 14,000 feet above sea level, your BPM could go as high as, could go to 165, and then what's 30% of 150? more than that, right? So that it could go as high as that. So that's just like um, estimates of what could happen to your heart rate when you're exercising at extreme temperatures and also at a altitude higher than sea level. Okay, so what's next for us? Maximal heart rate. Now, do take note that our heart could only beat a certain time, a certain number of times per minute. And HR max or MHR is often estimated based on age because HR max shows a slight but steady decrease about 1 beat per year beginning at 10 to 15 years old. Right? Um, what is HR max pala muna? I am so sorry. What is HR max? Now, HR max is the highest value achieved in an all-out effort to the point of volitional fatigue because you can't do it anymore, you know? Volitional fatigue. Yeah, so let's go back. We said HR is often estimated based on age because HR max shows a slight but steady decrease about 1 beat per year beginning at 10 to 15 years old. So as you grow older, your HR max also decreases. So, and this is reflected to two ways to get your maximal heart rate. So the first equation to get your heart rate, you know this but already, it's your maximal heart rate, your HR max is 220 minus age in years. So let's say you are 40 years old, your HR max would be 220 minus 40, so that's around 180 estimated. But in reality, manggod, no, about 68% of the total population in Earth, of the total population will have HR max higher or lower than 168 to 192 beats per minute, while 95% will fall between 156 to 204 beats per minute. So that's a really big range to play with, no? To really determine the HR max. So they devised a more accurate equation of our HR max. It's 208 minus 0.7 times age in years. So this is a more accurate measure for maximal heart rate. So if one is 24 years old, using both equations, what is their maximal heart rate? Okay, so as a review, no? In terms of response to exercise, your heart rate will increase. Where was that? Not that one. Dear, why did I do that? Okay, HR increases directly in proportion to the increase in exercise intensity. So HR will increase as your exercise intensity increases. Right? So the next response we'll be looking into is your stroke volume. Okay? So stroke volume is the volume of blood pumped out of the left ventricle of the heart during each systolic cardiac contraction. Or in other words, no, stroke volume is the volume of blood pumped per heartbeat. So every time our heart pumps, that's the stroke volume will be the volume or the amount of blood that is pumped out of that ventricle, right? So, stroke volume changes during acute exercise to allow the heart to meet the demands of exercise intensities. And it is determined by four factors. First is the volume of venous blood returned to the heart. Right? Do remember, no, the heart can only pump what blood only pump the blood that returns back to its chambers, right? So another one is we have ventricular distensibility. It's the capacity to enlarge the ventricle to allow maximal filling, right? So the ability for your ventricles to contain more blood, no, by enlarging itself. Because if you look at it, if you can contain more blood at that chamber, of course, more blood will come in and then more blood can come out of that chamber. So more volume of blood will be coming out of that chamber. So the first two factors influence the filling capacity of the ventricle, right? Now, the next two characteristics that influence the ventricle's ability to empty during dystole or dystole, I will discuss that now here. First one is ventricular contractility. It's the inherent capacity of the ventricle to contract more forcefully. Because if you think about it, if you can eject more blood out of your chamber, the better it is. The more blood will come out. And more blood will be supplied to our working muscles. So, our ventricle needs to be able to contract more forcefully, no? So that more blood can be distributed. Right. And the last one is aortic or pulmonary artery pressure. It's the pressure against which the ventricles must contract. So I said this kanina, no? The first two factors influence the filling capacity of the ventricle, while the last two influence the ventricle's ability to empty during systole. Determining the force of which blood is ejected and the pressure against which it must be expelled into the arteries. So what happens to stroke volume in response to exercise? Like heart rate, stroke volume increases with exercise. So if you look into this graph, now at rest, there's not a lot of stroke volume, but as exercise intensity increases, stroke volume will also increase. But as you can see, as you reach maximal exercise or maximal intensity of exercise, plateaus, stroke volume will plateau or flatline as exercise intensity increases. So it's very different. It's different compared to heart rate because heart rate will always just increase, as your intensity increases. But here, stroke volume increases with exercise, but plateaus as you reach maximal intensity levels. Now, there is a difference in stroke volume according to body position. So when your body is upright, or when you're standing up, for untrained individuals, stroke volume per minute, stroke volume is around 60 to 70 milliliters per beat. And then as we exercise, it could increase to 110 to 100 milliliters per beat. This values is higher when you are an elite endurance athlete. So stroke volume can start at 80 to 110 milliliters per beat, and then could go as high as 200 milliliters per beat when exercising. Now that is when your body is in an upright position. When you're in a supine position, stroke volume actually increases. Now the difference exists because in supine position, blood returns more easily to the heart because it doesn't have to pull at the lower extremities. Okay, so again, what happens to the stroke volume with exercise? It increases. Okay, now there's another response that we will look into. It's called the cardiac output. Now, or Q. Now, cardiac output is the amount of blood the heart pumps out. And it's actually the product of your heart rate and your stroke volume. So if you look at the equation Q, sorry, it's not shown here, no? So Q is equal to HR times SV. No, so this means that if your heart rate increases and your stroke volume increases, your cardiac output also increases. Same relationship will have goes to if your heart rate decreases and your stroke volume decreases, your cardiac output increase or decrease? Tama, no? Decrease. But to know how much increase or decrease happens, we have to look into the resting value of cardiac output. Normally, no, our resting cardiac output is 5 liters per minute. But remember, but do take note that this varies in proportion to the size of the person. Right, so if you're smaller, cardiac output will also be lower, no? So lower than 5 liters per minute. And if you're a bigger person, this could go higher. No, this volume will increase. Now, let's look at this time around. Let's look at the maximum cardiac output that could be produced by individuals. Now, the maximum cardiac output varies. It varies according to your size, and also it varies according to your training level. No? So let's look at the sedentary person. If you're a sedentary person and of normal size, no, of average size, you can produce at maximum level, no, less than 20 liters of blood per minute. But if you're aerobically trained, you can produce 40 liters of blood per minute. So generally, no, cardiac output predictably increases with increasing exercise intensity. This is because there is a need, or there should be a there is a need to increase blood flow to the exercising muscle, because our exercising muscle demands more oxygen. So therefore, the body should increase blood flow to that exercising muscle to meet its demand. As Q approaches maximal exercise or maximal intensity of exercise, it may reach plateau. So like stroke volume, no? It could reach plateau as we approach maximal exercise intensity. This is also like VO2 max, no? Our cardiac, when like VO2 max, when cardiac output approaches maximal intensity, exercise intensity, it may reach plateau. So VO2 max, no, is the maximum amount of oxygen that individuals can utilize during intense or maximal exercise. So there's just a range, or there's a limit to the amount of oxygen that an individual can use during maximal exercise, and that is VO2 max. Right? So like cardiac output, no, like VO2 max, they as maximal exercise intensity reaches a plateau. Sorry. Like VO2 max, when Q approaches maximal exercise intensity, it may reach plateau. In fact, it is likely that VO2 max is ultimately limited by the inability of Q to increase further, or cardiac output to increase further. So therefore our cardiac output will limit, because it cannot increase any further as we approach maximal exercise intensity, right? Yun yung sabi dito eh. No? It will reach a plateau. So since cardiac output cannot increase any further, the amount of oxygen delivered to our muscles is also limited. Right? So VO2 max is ultimately limited by the inability of cardiac output to increase any further. So yun yung nag-limit sa ating utilization of oxygen, because there's some more oxygen to be delivered. No, nalimitahan na. So let's have a review, no, of those 4 factors. Sabi natin, HR, stroke volume, cardiac output. Bakit tatlo lang? Tatlo lang pala siya. Right. So, as exercise intensity increases, HR max increase proportionately. No? Stroke volume also increases proportionately with increasing exercise, but plateaus when it reaches maximal volume or value. And we have increases in heart rate and stroke volume combined to increase cardiac output. So that's the heart's, just the heart response to exercise, to acute exercise. So let's have a look sa vascular system. First and foremost, we'll look into blood pressure first. Blood pressure is the force exerted by the blood on the walls of the arteries. Right? So, to see what happens to our systolic blood pressure and diastolic blood pressure, let's have a look sa ato ang normal blood pressure. Okay? Normally, no, our blood pressure is 120 over 80 millimeters of mercury, mmHg. Okay? What happens to our blood pressure when we do aerobic exercise or endurance exercise? The systolic blood pressure, the higher values, remember, a higher value usually, because it's the highest force exerted sa ato ang so systolic blood pressure, the first number indicates how much pressure your blood is exerting against your artery walls when the heart contracts. All right. In endurance exercise, systolic blood pressure increases in direct proportion to the increase in exercise intensity. So therefore, as exercise increases, systolic blood pressure also increases. So this value na makita natin karon, it's 120. It could go higher as exercise intensity increases. Note also that arterial blood pressure also increases. Actually, there is an increase from 120 to around 200 millimeters of mercury for normal, healthy, untrained individuals. And this is at maximal exercise. For elite individuals, it could go as high as 240 or 250 millimeters of mercury as at maximal intensities of aerobic exercise. Now let's look at what happens to our blood pressure with resistance exercise. If we do upper body exercise and leg exercise, when we're doing upper body exercise, it will cause an increase of blood pressure greater than that when compared to when we do leg exercise. Generally, blood pressure increases with resistance training, and it could go as high as 480 to 350 millimeters of mercury, especially at really high intensities, and if an individual performs Valsalva maneuver. So Valsalva maneuver is when you hold your breath so that you can overcome a heavy lift. So kanang mag-utong ka so that you can exert more force and overcome a very heavy resistance. Now, blood pressure facilitates the increase in blood flow through the vasculature. So because the greater the pressure, and this is created by the strong contraction of the heart, the faster the blood will flow throughout the body. So that is our systolic blood pressure. Now, normally, it will increase in direct proportion to an increase in exercise intensity. Now, let's look at the diastolic blood pressure. Diastolic blood pressure actually does not change significantly as exercise intensity increases. But actually, it can a little bit, it can slightly increase at maximal intensity. Now, you see here, no? So, balik tayo dun sa resistance training, but very high intensity and Valsalva maneuver is performed. Your diastolic pressure can go as high as 350 millimeters of mercury, no? But this will go back to normal states later on, no? After the Valsalva maneuver is completed successfully, hopefully. Right? Sana na siya. So that's blood pressure. Let's look at the blood flow sa atong blood flow naman sa atong cardiovascular system. Now, what is the responses? What are the responses of our cardiovascular systems in terms of blood flow? Since there's a acute increase in cardiac output and blood pressure during exercise, this will also increase the total blood flow to the body. Now, kasi since there are more blood volume to be delivered, and then there is a really strong contraction of the heart and more force is used to eject that increased volume of blood, right? There is also an increase in blood flow throughout our body, no? So in turn, the acute increases in cardiac output and blood pressure facilitates increased blood to areas with the greatest metabolic need. So remember, during one of their discussions, that if that organ needs blood, our system will redirect blood flow to those areas with greatest metabolic need. So when we exercise, our body will redirect blood flow through the area with greatest metabolic need, and that is our muscles. Okay, so through vasoconstriction action, through the vasoconstriction action of the sympathetic nervous system on local arterioles, blood flow is redirected from areas where elevated flow is not essential to those that are active during exercise. So when and during exercise, the sympathetic nervous system will control the vasoconstriction of our arterioles so that it meaning our blood will be distributed to our muscles. So instead of not instead, so kanang when exercising, blood will be directed to your muscles, and those areas in our body that does not need a lot of blood during that time, during exercise, they will limit or reduce the blood flow to those areas, such as the kidneys, the liver, intestines, stomach, and pancreas. Now, actually, during high-intensity exercise, the skeletal muscle may receive 80 to 85% of our cardiac output. So, dako siya, no? Most of our blood will go to our skeletal muscle, especially during high-intensity exercise. Now, if we exercise in a hot environment, there is also a redirection of blood to our skin. So there's an increase of blood flow to our skin so that we can control and regulate our internal temperature. By increasing blood flow through the skin, we are able to dissipate internal heat faster and quicker, right? Sana siya. So in relation to your redirection of blood flow through the skin, so instead of all of it being focused on the skeletal muscle, naghati na ngayon, no? Hati na ngayon if kanang our body needs to dissipate or to regulate our internal temperature. There is actually a term called cardiovascular drift. Okay? This cardiovascular drift is generally associated with increasing body temperature and dehydration. Cardiovascular drift happens during prolonged exercise in a hot environment, at a steady state. Okay? So what happens is that when we're exercising for a long period of time in a hot environment at the same uh, intensity, right? Our stroke volume decreases, our heart rate increases, but cardiac output is the same. However, arterial blood pressure decreases. Why? Right? Because there is a need to redirect blood to the skin so that our body can cool. But because of that, no, the redirection of blood to the skin, sa atong plasma, di ba, meron, in our plasma, there is water content. So, that is used for sweating so that we can cool down or can cool our body. So, this will lessen the blood returning to a volume of blood returning to our heart. No? So the redirection of blood to skin for cooling lessens the blood returning to the heart, thus explaining why stroke volume, the amount of blood pumped out of your heart per beat. So the SV decreases, and to compensate, to maintain cardiac output, what our body does is that it will increase the heart rate, right? So that it's the same cardiac output. So your heart rate will increase, but stroke volume actually has decreased already. When we are teaching, when we're coaching, and if we are athletes now, we have to also take note that, of course, there will always be competition for blood supply, right? Because as you have observed in previous slides, that the sympathetic nervous system will control the vasoconstricture of our arterioles so that blood can be directed or redirected to organs that has a higher metabolic need. So in terms of redirection of blood flow through skeletal muscles or gastrointestinal system, in application, athletes should be cautious in timing their meals before competition to maximize blood flow to active muscles during exercise. Usually, a large meal, it can be digested after very large meal, 4 hours, and then for snacks, it's around 2 hours. So athletes, dapat nga i-time yun na siya well. And also, there is also a competition for blood supply when we're exercising in a hot environment. So if you're anticipating or if you're going to exercise for a long period of time in a hot environment, do take note that your blood supply will be divided to your exercising muscle and also your skin to regulate internal body temperature. All right, so that's our vascular system. So let's have a look at your blood, the fluid medium of our cardiovascular system. We'll be looking into 3 areas of our blood: the oxygen content of our blood, we'll look at the plasma volume of our blood, and also the hemoconcentration of our blood. First and foremost, oxygen content. What happens to the blood's oxygen content when we exercise? So with increasing intensity of exercise, our AVO2 difference increases progressively. So AVO2 means arterioventricular or arteriovenous oxygen difference. So this is the difference between oxygen content of the arterial blood and the mixed venous blood. All right, again, arteriovenous oxygen difference or AVO2 difference. So what happens as exercise intensity increases to our AVO2 difference? So it increases also progressively. This difference reflects decreasing venous oxygen content. Now, so as blood returns back to the heart, no, your venous blood, oxygen content also decreases, right? At rest, usually the AVO2 difference is around 4 to 5 milliliters per 100 ml of blood. And during exercise, it could go up to 16 milliliters per 100 ml of blood. So these values indicate that more oxygen is extracted from the blood by the working muscles. Right? So, plasma volume. What happens to our plasma volume? So, upon standing or onset of exercise, there is an immediate loss of plasma from the blood to the interstitial fluids phase. Now, plasma, no, as plasma gani kay, plasma is actually a component of our blood, and then it is composed of salt, water, proteins. It's actually the liquid part of the blood. Right? So again here now, so when we stand up, when we start our exercise, there's an immediate loss of plasma from the blood. Okay? With prolonged exercise, there is actually a 10 to 15 reduction in plasma. So this is for aerobic exercise, and for resistance training, plasma volume loss is proportional to the intensity of the effort. So the more intense your exercise or your the weights that you're lifting is, the more plasma will be lost. Okay? Now, if you're exercising for a long period of time under the very hot conditions, more plasma volume is lost. When does plasma volume, a decrease in plasma volume, impair performance? When it's more than 60%. Why? A decrease in plasma volume of more than 60% will impair performance because it increases blood viscosity. So since super lapot na siya, it will impede blood flow, thus limiting oxygen transport. So dili na siya makahatag og oxygen sa mga organs that need it because it's too viscous to flow. Right, and another area that we look into is the hemoconcentration of blood. Hemoconcentration is when your blood becomes more concentrated with hemoglobin, hematocrit, and plasma proteins. Now, hemoconcentration occurs when plasma volume decreases. Right? So, plasma lang mismo. Your hematocrit levels could be the same or it could be increased. So when plasma is reduced, the cellular or protein portion become more concentrated in blood. So this in turn increased the RBC concentration in blood. So RBC gani, no? An increase in RBC concentration per unit of blood substantially increases blood's oxygen carrying capacity. Now, this is very advantageous during exercise, especially at altitude, right? So, sa hemo concentration will increase as exercise intensity increase as well. So that is our cardiovascular system's response to acute exercise. So our blood, no, our blood concentration is affected, no, by exercise. What else is there? Alamin nyo na. So let's move on to your respiratory responses to acute exercise. Now, we'll be specifically looking at pulmonary ventilation during dynamic exercise. So when we anticipate that, when our body anticipates that exercise will occur, it will increase the breathing rate of an individual, no, as an anticipatory response. This initial respiratory response is controlled by our brain. Now, breathing rate, no, so after that initial response, no, controlled by the brain, another factor that can change the breathing rate and the depth of inspiration is the respiratory system's response to changes in chemical status of the arterial blood. So if our system senses that there is an increase in carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions in our arterial blood, this is sensed by the chemoreceptors in our brain, carotid bodies, lungs, muscles, and right ventricle. They will signal an increase in the rate and depth of inspiration. So if there's a lot of carbon dioxide content in your body, that will trigger an increase in the rate and depth of inspiration, because usually exercise will produce more carbon dioxide, because as exercise progresses, there is an increased metabolism in the muscle, and it will generate more carbon dioxide and hydrogen, right? So these carbon dioxide and hydrogen needs to be unloaded by the body to our venous blood. And since now that it is detected that there is an increase in carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions in our bloodstream, our body responds by increasing the rate and depth of inspiration, so that these carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions is removed from your body. All right? So that happens when we exercise, no? So as exercise intensity increases, your rate of breathing also increases, and depth of breathing also increases. Now, at the end of exercise, pulmonary ventilation returns to a normal rate at a slower pace, right? This is because respiratory recovery takes several minutes after exercise. This is because our body needs to regulate the acid-base balance, the partial pressure of dissolved carbon dioxide, and blood temperature. So these factors regulate our breathing rate. So once acid-base balance is achieved, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide normalizes and blood temperature normalizes, our breathing rate returns to normal. Okay? So at the end of exercise, muscle energy demands decrease almost to resting levels, but pulmonary ventilation returns to normal at a slower rate. So let's have a look at the respiratory limitations to performance. So respiration requires energy, and this energy is used by the respiratory muscles during pulmonary ventilation. So as rate and depth of ventilation increases, energy cost of respiration increases. Now, according to statistics, the diaphragm, intercostal muscle, and abdominal muscle account for 11% of the total oxygen consumption and 15% of the cardiac output. Now, during recovery from dynamic exercise, sustained elevations in ventilation occur at for 9% to 12% of the total oxygen consumed post-exercise. Do take note that pulmonary ventilation, our breathing rate, is not a limiting factor for performance even during maximal effort. However, if you're an individual with restricted or obstructed airway, or if you have asthma, your respiratory system can limit performance. Now, in terms of respiratory system's regulation of the acid-base balance, excess hydrogen ions decreases pH levels. So this happens because the byproduct of muscle contraction is lactic acid. No? So that's it has a extra hydrogen ion. No? If lactic acid remains in the muscle's pH level decreases and it becomes more acidic. And if our muscle is acidic, muscle contractility doesn't happen, or it impairs muscle contractility, and also ATP generation. So to maintain acid-base balance, the respiratory system increases rate and depth of inspiration. So whenever we inspire, whenever we breathe, carbon dioxide reduces the hydrogen ion concentration in our blood. So actually, your carbon dioxide is transported via the blood, attached first to the bicarbonate. And then when in the lungs, it becomes carbon dioxide again, and then it is exhaled out of the system. Right. So that's one of the major roles of our respiratory system to regulate acid-base balance. So we really need to breathe, to increase our breathing rate as well, so that, and the depth of inspiration, so that metabolic byproducts is removed from our body, especially our carbon dioxide. We don't want a very acidic environment for our muscles and our cells to be in, because it will stop working. Our body will stop working if it is in a acidic environment. Right? So in closing, in this chapter, we highlighted the cardiovascular system's responses to acute exercise. We also described the mechanisms they employ to address the demands of exercise on our body. We also considered the limitations that these systems can impose on abilities to perform sustained aerobic exercise. So thank you for listening, and I hope that you learned something. Thank you. Goodbye.